Hey everybody, welcome back to You Are Free TV. It is Tuesday, November 22nd, 2022. I'm so glad to be back with you today. And I am here again with my great friends, Douglas Gabriel and Michael McKibben. We have Douglas from aimfortruth.org, which so many of you are so familiar with their great work they do in exposing the hidden history and getting out the truth. And then, of course, we have Michael McKibben from Americans for Innovation, where also his company, Leader Technologies, created the platform, which became what is now the social media platform that everybody uses. And they had that technology stolen. And that's a whole other story that I'm sure if you love Aim for Truth, you've already heard the meat of that. And you can go to their websites below and check them out. So welcome to the channel, you all. We're going to dive in here today.
Great to be here.
Thank you.
Okay, so what we're talking about, we're doing a series here talking about how we have the what is the use of global usury that was created by a group called the Rodanites out of Babylon, and we're reaching back into thousands of years ago and talking about how this cabal has hidden through stolen identities. Specifically back then through the use of the Hebrew identity and the Hebrew people and coming out of Babylon to run basically a cartel throughout the world and getting to today. And we want to expose that history. We're going to get into a whole bunch besides. But let's start there and have, again, an introduction to the Rodanites, and we'll move further from there. Whichever one of you wants to jump in with that.
Okay, I'll start. Rodanites. These are people who are from an area called Rodan, which is essentially a southeastern suburb of what is now Baghdad. Back then it was called Babylon. And it wasn't a term that any of us had ever heard of. And in fact, the term first came into history with the findings and writings of an Arab geographer, and I won't attempt to torture his last name, but he wrote in the 800 AD, that Babylon, the banking and currency systems in Babylon were controlled by what he called Rodanite Babylonians or Rodanite Jews. And he specifically identified them as Jewish and identified multiple families. Well, since then, there have been discoveries in the 1800s of what are called cuneiform contracts. In other words, these are clay contracts that describe all kinds of banking transactions that went on in the area, the greater area of Babylon, that describe specifically how interest was charged on loans, and that these bankers were in fact controlling the business, the technology, the engineering, the tax collection, the government, the administration of all of Babylon. And specifically, this Arab geographer referred to them as Jewish. And specifically, there were several families of Jewish bankers that go back to 600 years before Christ, called the Agibi family, and another one, the Marushu family. A historian, a Turkish historian writing in England in 1840s, described these families as Babylonian Rothschilds. And it was a metaphorical term, obviously, but they were describing how central those bankers were to the operation of the entire state of Babylon. And that's who are described as Rodanite Jews, because they lived in this area called Rodan in Babylon. And so from there, we started extrapolating, because that was very interesting. They were charging interest 600 years before Christ. And this was, in fact, the same time that the various prophets of Israel were railing against the charging of interest and usury as an exploitive practice that enslaved people that disenfranchised certain citizens. And then once the compound interest kicked in, these people became slaves because they couldn't pay back the interest and pay back the principal. So they went into slavery. They could never get out. Their families went into slavery, their children. And this was the same group that was practicing child sacrifice. If we go back, I think more and more people are beginning to understand that the gods of Mammon, Moloch, and Baal were Babylonian pagan deities that literally sacrificed children as a part of their religious practice. So what we're seeing here now is a combining of this historical activity of banking in Babylon with child sacrifice and human trafficking. And that is shocking because that was that happened in 600 BC. Now we are finding that it was going on much earlier than that, going back into Abraham's time and Nimrod's time, that this practice of charging interest or usury goes way back in Babylon, even before Babylon was the term, back in the Amorite days and even the Canaanite days.
Excellent description. Thank you so much. And could you also maybe carry on with the stolen identity issue here, the Sogdians, and how it appeared that these people claiming to be Hebrews were actually Babylonians, but not necessarily of the Hebrew faith, and kind of stole that identity moving forward. Could you explain that a bit?
Douglas, you want to take a shot at that? We were just talking about that before we came on the air.
Yes, when you study banking, which we've done intelligence reports on, what you arrive at is what you just call, I love your moniker there, Free, the Babylonian cartel. Yes, these are banking families, Babylonian banking families who subsumed the identity for protection of being a Hebrew. And technically they were perhaps partially Hebrew, but by the time they went in their invasion, which took over the entire Silk Road from the eastern ends of China all the way to the Western Turkic Khaganate, which we're going to talk about, called Khazarians, because then they try to say Jews or the Khazarians, and the Khazarians became Jews. We found out that almost everything that I knew as a historian, that I thought I knew from studying textbooks and teaching, going to college, that's all a big smokescreen. That is propaganda. This is a banking family invasion of the world's markets and commerce routes that has been going on for 4,000 years. And so when they say Rothschild Babylonians or Babylonian Rothschilds, well, that's not far off, because it's the same methodology of predatory economic banking, which starts wars, ends wars. They also managed all the land, so they managed all the resources. So these supposed Hebrews taken into captivity, both the first and second captivity into Babylon, is basically nonsense. In the end, they subsumed the entire Babylonian culture. They became the ministers of everything, as Michael has just pointed out. They were in control of everything. They married into every single culture around them. And somehow, even though the Persians, what they would call the Persian or the Babylonians, the Indo-Aryans, they gave over their trade routes to the Sogdians, the supposed Jews, because they're not Jews, the Rodanites from Babylon, who perhaps did marry with the Jews because that was their infiltration, their subversion. That was their strategy, was to move in and basically take over where the money was flowing. And that also included slaves and spices and coins and everything. The silks, all the things from the East were considered to be, they were the new addictions of the people in the West. And so they just couldn't be satisfied. And that includes specifically trafficking human beings, as Free, you mentioned in our conversation before the podcast. So what we're talking about here is that we went back and looked at any silly mythological reference to ethnocentrism or people being against the Hebrews. They're not Hebrews. The Samaritans are about 9% Hebrew blood. The Ethiopians are about 10%. And so the black Jews were just demonstrating, I think, in the streets of New York for some reason just yesterday, basically claiming we're the only true Jews left on the face of the earth. Well, they're kind of accurate. There's what we would call Ashkenazi or Sephardic Jews have about 1-2%, the European Jews. And when you talk about Khazarians, well, it's all been so obfuscated, you can't actually determine how the final Turkic kingdoms in the Western Cognate was turned into Judaism. And the mythology about that is so ridiculous that we have to now, as we read these things, just laugh because they're so far from the truth.
That's very interesting, and very interesting about the Ethiopian Jews just recently coming out into the streets of New York City. I hadn't heard that yet. And to bring back in here this concept of stolen identity and using a sort of protected class status, but creating the oppression that gives them the protected class status to hide behind, and that these banking families are behind all of the oppression, the warring, that led to the persecution of the people who worship as Jews, who practice Judaism.
Well, back in the day, I'm sorry to interrupt, but back in the day, the Rhodanite Babylonians were the bankers of the what would be called the Dark Ages, from 300-400 AD right up to the Crusades. These were well-trodden paths from, as Douglas said, all the way from the West Europe all the way to China, and they were well known as pagans, as Babylonian Rhodanites, and only later did they add the name Jew to it. And I think that we've been looking at that, and what we think is going on here is up until the bankers wanted to start moving into the royalty of Europe, they didn't need to have a great three religions identity. So they were quite happy to be known as Babylonian pagans. But at some point, about the time of the Crusades, they must have decided that this is time. We better move into Europe, but we've got to have a different identity. We can't be known as pagans. We need to pick one of the great religions. Now, the story that's emerged from the story of the Khazars is that was exactly the Khazars' thinking, that we've got to identify with one of the great religions if we're going to carry on with any legitimacy. And so the story, the mythology goes that they chose Judaism. But what we think happened is those Babylonian Rhodanites, as they were having difficulties with the invading Seljuk Turks right before the First Crusade, is they decided we've got to change our identity. So let's pick one of the sons of Noah and attach our name to him. So they attached it to Ashkenaz, who came down from Mount Ararat, and there's a number of villages with that name or similar name in eastern Turkey today. And so they just picked one, Ashkenaz. So they became Ashkenazi Jews. As far as we can tell, that was nothing but a propaganda rebranding, and that they were already all over Europe. So all of a sudden, if you read the histories, it's kind of laughable now. But you read the histories of the Rhodanites, who were very powerful bankers of the Silk Road back in the first 1,000 years after Christ. And then all of a sudden, the history just say, and then they disappeared.
That's very,
what came into,
go ahead.
Yeah. And so what came into being was the term Ashkenazi, and they simply rebranded their presence in Europe. That's why there's so many Jews, Ashkenazi Jews in Europe, because the Rhodanites had covered the ground all over Europe, and they were doing business with the various kings who did not like usury, did not want to use interest. And so what they were doing with the Rhodanites was finessing that. And then once they became Ashkenazi Jews, then they started appearing as the court Jews in these various royals all over Europe. And what we think is, or at least I think, is that the royals in Europe, as they battled for control of these various city-states and these mini kings, is the Rodenites just became the royals and converted or became Christians, and then they brought in their brothers, the Rodnite Babylonians, to be their bankers, since they could not charge usury officially. But what we now know from the records is they had shell companies, secret accounts. They were getting paid on the side. So we see this unholy alliance between the royals of Europe, who were supposedly Christian, and the court Jews. And what we're concluding is they were all Babylonian Radhanites. They just rebranded as Ashkenazi or the royals, and as Douglas has pointed out before, made up stories about how they got started, when you can't find any legitimacy for these early royals before 1200 AD.
Let me just throw in here too that, you know, around that time you're talking about, the Dark Ages, or, you know, those first several centuries there of AD, and then into the Dark Ages, we also have kind of the stolen identity of the Christians and the early Christians, and the institutionalization that became, you know, Rome and the Pope and the Vatican, and the stealing of so much wealth across the world using that stolen identity. If we look at like the writings of the Essenes, or for the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they're talking about archons, and, you know, that the whole other race is taking over what was the early Christianity teachings, changing them completely into something else. To me, I kind of I relate it to, you know, the Torah becoming the Talmud, or, you know, that the teachings of Christ then were brought into this institutionalized other kind of slavery system, you know, through the Vatican, through Catholicism, which then created you know, the Jesuit system. That created a whole class of spies for the Vatican that would go, you know, across the world, bringing in, you know, as economic hitmen, really to bring in these bankers, these Babylonian cartel bankers, into countries to, you know, consolidate power, wealth, all of it. And so the combining of those two stolen identities, you know, is what we're looking at, this this real changing around of history, and especially religion, especially you know, for me, Christianity and the morality of Christianity. But that's an aside. But so I wanted to get in here and bring in, you all have been doing some great research around the archaeology aspect and the destruction of these records, and the, you know, what I was saying before, the killing of history here, the total rewriting of history. And I was wondering if you could bring in what you've been finding out about that.
Yeah, just of late, we had run across a reference to the fact that there were great archaeological activities occurring in 1830s, 40s in all of Mesopotamia, especially Nineveh and down to Babylon. And it was primarily run by the British, with some work by the French and some by the Germans. But the work by the British was carried out under the leadership of a general in the British East India Company. And these were amazing finds. And the latest summary is they dug up something like 30 tons of antiquities that included major statues, tens of thousands of cuneiform contracts, business contracts, and they had to build barges to take this booty from above, around the area what is called Mosul, all the way to the Persian Gulf, which was their objective, to take it to England, to Paris, and some to Berlin. But the primary stash was going to go to the British Museum. And what we see in the record is that they collected all this information, they put it on these barges. It was about 30 tons of information and artifacts. And then by the time they got down to what is now Basra, they had been boarded and raided numerous times. And by the time they got down to Basra, all the ships were sunk. And today, it's interesting that that's where the British had their headquarters during the Iraq Wars.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. That seemed to, a lot of these wars often are this destruction of history. They want to go in and destroy the evidence, right?
Right.
We see it
so what I think we're going to find, we've seen some of this evidence so far. What we're going to find is cuneiform contracts that are going to further verify the earlier work by the archaeologists, the Turkish archaeologists that of the Agibi family and the Marushu family. We're going to see additional confirmation that whatever the Rodonite Jews were, they were the ones running Babylon. And it looks like what they were doing in 1830s was they were getting rid of the evidence. And specifically, this particular general, his name was Sir Henry Rawlinson. And as it's turning out, Sir Henry was a contemporary of none other than Cecil Rhodes, Lord Roberts, the general in the Second Boer War, Alfred Milner, and he actually got his son to fight with Milner and in the Second Boer War. And so what we're seeing is this British East India Company leader was leading this supposed barge of archaeology south on the Tigris River, and then lost it all in the sinking of these barges. Now you're going to ask, did they find any after that? There were some attempts, half-hearted attempts, to find some things, and they did. But the great bulk of the 200, and they estimate 235 crates of information, evidence, cuneiform contracts were lost and never found again.
Well, that's very convenient, isn't it? And it's like the Smithsonian basement at the bottom of the ocean there. Just down there somewhere. So, Douglas, do you want to bring it up forward here? We have, of course, the timely death of Evelyn de Rothschild there on November 8th on Election Day. And he is specifically interesting, connected to bringing all this into the modern, what is now just the full satanic out in the open global grab for everything. They're going for it all. And this usury system has now become, it doesn't even have to be money anymore. Now it's going to be your social credit. It's going to be basically imposing a whole new value system on people. So I'm kind of
Let me add one more person, Lord Rothschild. So the Rothschild, Walter Rothschild, who signed the Balfour Declaration, was also contemporary of Rawlinson, who sunk those ships in the South Tigris.
Yep.
I'd love to bash a Rothschild. Are you kidding? Evelyn de Rothschild, first off, where did he get that name? Second off, he is the Queen's personal financier, which means he has more power than the head of the Bank of England, which is, of course, the most evil of all the central banks, except for the Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland. So when you're talking about Rothschilds, we again and again prove it is no conspiracy. But let's remember, they weren't Rothschilds and they weren't Bowers. They were Bacharachs. And what's a Bacharach? Bacharach is the Jewish city, supposed Ashkenazi Jewish city on the Rhine, which was the source of basically giving the money for the Hanseatic League to begin, which started then the competitions to take the trade routes from land to sea. And so there in Bacharach, which is what the real name is, those are all made up people. They didn't exist. They had been there since before, or certainly the second that the Romans came there. But these are Rodonites who came there even before. So they established trading cities. So there was no diaspora. It was a commercial invasion of the entire world that is quite successful to this very day. Rothschilds are just another name. And remember, the Rodonites changed their name. They subsumed the Sogdians. They subsumed the Khazarians. They subsumed the Ashkenazi when they moved out of what the Persian or Babylon. and moved into Turkey. And then all of a sudden, oh, they're the direct descendants of the great grandson of Noah, when in fact they're not even Hebrews. The name Jews, yes, is associated with the tribe of Judah, but I would probably say that the name Jew, as it was talked about in ancient Babylon, not ancient, in New Babylon, and of course now we're in the age of the whore of Babylon. When they said Jew, they described what they meant. They weren't talking about a Hebrew. They were talking about one of these crossbred Radnite Hebrew, possible, or Radnites crossbred with everyone. And they said that they were whores of their temples, and the temples of Ishtar and Inanna, they were temples of what we would call prostitution now. And so they said that their indulgences, overindulgences in having too many wives, going to the prostitution temples, and being obsessed with the gain of power through money and land and manipulation, that's a Jew. So when I say, I've said this forever, I don't say Jew unless I'm talking about someone who's a Babylonian Radnite, or as you like to call them, the Babylonian cartel, because to this very day, they created the modern, they subsumed the Silk Road, and then they started creating the water road to the east, which created then the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company. And those are still banking families who are trying to hide their history by creating silly mythologies that pass for history when they are not, remembering that it is the pen, it is the writing of the historian, the winner of the battle, who writes the history. And so these are the same people who created Yiddish as a secret language to take over Sogdian on the Silk Road, and then they used it to bring this power and control into the monarchy and into the court Jews, as Michael has pointed out, and also what I would call the Lombards and the Rus. And when you're looking at this, then that goes back to the mythology that the Khazarians are the greatest warriors. Everyone knows the Vikings are the greatest warriors. And so the mixing and subsuming of these clever Radnites create what we know, what we could call the rat lines of modern banking through the banking families that still exist to this day after 4,000 years of continuous control of their plan for global hegemony.
Wonderfully said. Thank you. It's interesting when you talk about, Rothschild being the banker for the Queen, and the interesting factor here of, now that we have Ron DeSantis being launched into the presidency, the attempt here after Trump just announced, I was saying earlier that the Republican Jewish coalition just met last weekend in Las Vegas, and they, Adelson's dead now, and so they've got they brought in all the Jesuit people to speak on the Sabbath, on the Saturday there during the event. They brought in Zelensky on the big screen. They brought in Netanyahu on the big screen, and then they, they're trying to put up DeSantis here. They're backing DeSantis tons of money. Peter Singer and his people are the ones backing, and they didn't back Trump before, those same funding sources. So I just wanted to get into DeSantis because, of course, now we have Rishi Sunak, the exchequer, coming in as the prime minister, pushing the CBDCs, and we have the reality here of DeSantis' sister, Christina DeSantis' mysterious death while she was auditing Coots Bank and the highest banks that the Queen, and she was auditing covered accounts. And so I was wondering if you could move into that for a minute here.
Well, we looked at Ron's background, and a couple of things popped out real quickly that somebody's trying to hide here. In that we were just reading his Wikipedia page, and within a day of reading a reference to something called St. Elmo's Hall and his membership in St. Elmo's Hall at Yale, the next day we went into that Wikipedia reference and it was gone. And so when we dug into St. Elmo's Hall, what we discover is there were 7 different types of halls, secret societies at Yale at the time. One was Skull and Bones, and everybody, I think, probably incorrectly assumed St. Elmo's Hall must be a part of Skull and Bones. It's not. And St. Elmo's Hall was created in 1888, right as the Rothschilds and the Queen Victoria were creating something called the Knights of Malta English Priory. And as it turns out, they started this St. Elmo's Hall at Yale that same year, and it was associated with the Knights of Malta. And that was the secret society group that Ron was involved in while he was playing baseball at Yale. So there was nothing distinguishing about his schooling, his work, his publications, his activity, except that he was there and somebody made him a member of St. Elmo's Hall and then wanted to delete it, so that as he was pushed forward more recently than what we did that about 6 months ago, we discovered that somebody's trying to wipe the record clean of his St. Elmo Hall background. So when that happens, you know somebody's hiding something.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then, of course, the strange death of his sister, you know, auditing the most powerful bank in the world, and one of the oldest banks, from what I understand. It goes way back to the 1600s, I think, that you all.
It's one of the oldest banks in the world, right?
And I just no mention of that, except for that, you know, people in these families always end up dead, you know.
Well, I mean, look at it. She died in London while he was a sitting congressman, and there was no news about it. None. And then when somebody tried to inquire, they were castigated for asking the question. So clearly somebody's protecting Ron. He's groomed like Pompeo's groomed, like Zuckerberg was groomed. I mean, you name the head of any of these groups right now, they were all groomed by this same group of Babylonian Radonites through what is the Pilgrim Society in London.
Excellent. And isn't that bank with those covered accounts, which are basically secret accounts, you know, tons of money laundering, but it's very associated with one of the biggest holdings for uranium funds? Isn't that the case as well? Yeah.
Well, the queen has the king has a golden share over all the nuclear capabilities within the British Empire, and we have subsumed all of those contracts within the control of the British through Kinetic, through Serco, through what's called the Atomic Weapons Establishment, through Lockheed Martin. So we gave over decades ago all of our sovereignty related to nuclear to the British. The British are running our army.
Yes, there's the company Urenco, which is principally owned by the Queen's Golden Share, now the King's Golden Share. Then they do our uranium enrichment here in America, and we don't control it. And we certainly don't control the uranium that is being taken from missiles and being used in our nuclear power plants. That is given over to the Russians. So the Queen and Putin are best friends when it comes to uranium. And remember the entire uranium deal that paid $125 million into one particular Clinton foundation and perpetual funds into another one, the Clinton Justra Sustainability Fund. So when we're talking about, yes, the Queen through Coots, through Evelyn, the Rothschild, that's where they hide their real money. But then they manipulate currencies, particularly central bank currencies, through the Bank of England, which again is controlled by Evelyn de Rothschild. And now whoever the new financier for Charles will be, it will undoubtedly be in the Rothschild family. That's a given. It's been that way for a long time. But remember, there's a law in Britain. It is illegal for you to look into the economic business of the monarchy. That's why she was killed.
Yeah, I mean, killed at 90, whatever, you know.
I mean, what? No, why DeSantis' sister was killed?
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah.
She tripped over the accounts of the wrong people. Okay, it's
Absolutely.
real simple what happened there.
Absolutely. I mean, and that would seem obvious to anybody who has two brain cells, and so, but that's his sister, and her fiance was also tied in with those banks as well. And we
Yeah, he
have,
was employed by Coutts Bank for 8 years.
that was it, right, right. And then we have DeSantis's Navy career, very unestablished anything except for just being a congressman out of nowhere,
Well,
getting pushed up into this position.
he's a Crown agent, and so is the person that we assumed he'd be running with, Candy Owens. And now it looks like Candy has already played her cards too soon, and so now Nikki Haley has to come out screaming that she has to be in charge of the world, because she was in charge of the world when she was at the United Nations, right? She told the president what to do. So now she's got experience. She can tell everyone what to do. And these are Crown agents. These are people looking for the order of the British Empire. They want to become Knights of the Garter. These are people who understand where the Babylonian cartel has come from. And you mentioned the Vatican and the Jesuits. Ignatius of Loyola basically became a black warrior for the commercialism of the Vatican, learning his tricks from the Levant when he went there and was in a war and got wounded. And he came back, and basically he then understood what the Hebrews meant by pogrom, and he understood what the prophet meant by jihad. And so he came back and said to the Pope, "We'll kill anybody you want. We'll do whatever you want. We're really good at poisoning, and we're really good at mimicking what was the Templar Knights, the Knights of Templar Knights, and then they became the Hospitallers, and then they became the Knights of Malta, and the Jesuits became their protectors. And the Knights of Malta became the largest insider trading group for monarchies, and what is called the Black Monarchy, those who are deposed from their monarchy, control over their nation, but still have the wealth and the rat lines. So the Jesuits simply copied the Babylonian cartel. And the Radonites are so good at hiding what they do that they fly the flag of being a British royalty. These are court Jews. The Rothschilds are court Jews. It was a sin to handle coinage. Coinage all came from the temple, and it represented usually barley. It represented your work, the grain that then was the lifeblood of the people. And then they turned it into coins represented that, and they'd give them to the farmers, and the farmers could come back and get back new barley seed for a new year with the coins. Well, when that was turned into paying for sacrifices by the male priesthood that took over all traditional religions of those times, which were, in fact, as we pointed out, in some cases, worship of demons, then money became literally associated with mammon, and it was considered to be the sin of sins to handle money, the sin of sins to charge money on loaning out money, called usury. And the worst people that there were, lower than any other caste, were the ones called the tax collectors. Those are the Radonites. Those are what would be appropriately called, with a derogatory term, Jew.
Thank you for summing that up. It's interesting that you mentioned coinage, because for when the grain came in, when they first started using grain as money, it revolutionized humanity's diet, for one thing, made people less strong. It made us shorter. It really changed our entire stature. And then it was used because you had to have the grain, you had to become a farmer. And then it was, the early introduction of that slavery system, making it larger and larger, to make the nomadic people basically enslaved in a domesticated sphere, and creating these kingdoms that came out of that. And they're about to do that again now with the new diet that they're pushing on us, bugs and whatnot, but the vertical farming, the stealing of all the land by Bill Gates, et cetera, the putting the mRNA into our foodstuffs, and to taking away the meat, to taking away the true food of humanity. And so that's all happening now on the next level. We're escalating now as they consolidate the power to fewer and fewer people, really going for broke here in this satanic system that we are now just, headlong on the verge of wide open horror Babylon, completely out in the open. And again, with it, the new world religion that is going to come, connected to transhumanism. And this coinage is now, of course, gone into the digital space. And so I wanted to talk about that, because now you don't even have to have a coin. You don't have to have anything. It's all based on ideas and propaganda and mind manipulation and slavery through perception deception, as David Icke calls it. David Icke, who's also uncovered a lot of what you're discussing here about these group of people. And what I wanted to go from here is to talk about FTX, and if you all wanted to touch on that, because we have with this giant Ponzi scheme that just collapsed, the 100 million that went to the Democrats, the funneling through the Ukraine, but also the minting of coins out of nowhere. FTX created FTT, and they made it have any value whatsoever by only having it bought by Alameda Research, their other company, their dual company, and that created what became its value at $2 billion. Valuation was completely fake and totally counterfeit, which is how they got basically caught out in the end for the Ponzi scheme that was going on. And I was wondering if either of you wanted to add your 2 cents about what's going down here with this collapse of the Ponzi scheme of FTX.
Yeah, that was exactly what Goldman Sachs did with insider Facebook stock before the Facebook IPO. They got the insiders to share their stock, and then Goldman did something that's on the books illegal. They took a share of private stock and they split it into 5,000 sub shares, 10,000 sub shares, and then they sold those shares to various of their insiders. And that was intended to drive the opening price valuation of Facebook up over 100 million. So this is not a new practice. They've been doing this for 4 millennia. And so this is not new. They know how to do it. They know how to take nothing and make it something as far as money is concerned. But then the next time we saw this more recently was with the Enron scam. And we were looking at the Enron scam when we were investigating Candace Owens, because her father-in-law, Sir, what's his name? Douglas, I forgot it.
Michael Farmer.
Michael Farmer. Yeah, he essentially has worked for Rothschild for 30 years and is the silver and gold metals merchant that has pushed much of our modern cash valuations and used gold and silver as collateral against these phony loans, which they never intend to pay back. And then they've gone even farther. Farmer owns these supposed gold mines, gold and silver mines, which are probably nothing more than holes in the ground that when they need to get an auditor, they pay off an auditor to say, yeah, there's this much value in the ground. So they start selling shares in these fake gold and silver mines. And so it just goes on and on. They know how to do this. And so the whole Enron scam appears to have been a mechanism to create a crisis, another false flag, in order to consolidate the Reuters/Rothschild control of the London Stock Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange and the Chicago exchanges, to consolidate all that control and push it through a series of convoluted backdoor relationships back to an organization that created the software to control these transactions that's headquartered out of London. So in the end, all of our transactions and exchanges have built a rhodonite rat line back to London. And so we've proven that now with the collapse of the Enron company and the creation of these ICE, Intercontinental Commodities Exchange, and the New York Stock Exchange are now under the covers, all controlled by Reuters out of London. Now, why would Reuters be involved? Well, it's propaganda, because that's the main stuff of fake financial transactions.
That's great. You just said that so well. And, I'm glad you brought Enron into it, because it's very interesting, because at least with Enron, the FBI raided them. There was the confiscation of their everything, and we knew
that was a great kabuki theater, wasn't it?
Oh, completely.
Made for great TV.
Yeah. But now with this, Bahamian Rhapsody there, the whole situation there with the clubhouse there on the Bahamas, crickets. Where's the FBI? No raid there. It was twice the amount of money as Enron.
They're yawning. They're yawning because we got to do this again. Okay, go ahead.
You're like, thanks for that crypto trade that you just gave me. And And for me, I have a kind of a theory about so much of this going to the Democrats, and we have FTX starting like a week after Joe Biden announced he was running, back when he announced, and so FTX started like a week later. His mother is created Vote. It's not Act Blue, but it's something
Yeah.
Vote. I can't remember the name. I didn't prepare that, but basically, then we have the whole stealing of the election, right?
Well, hang on, wait a second. We've been looking at some of these early paperwork, and we're seeing Scaramucci's name pop up in various holdings that he's had in FTX. So this is a Rhino Republican activity as well as Democrats.
Which goes to show that it's both sides. That's a uniparty.
Right.
We have a completely rigged system, and it has been for ages. But did all that FTX, did a bunch of that FTX money go into paying off everybody it would have, been required to pay off in order to steal this election? Because it doesn't just happen. It gets down to, the smallest of offices and these election boards, the people involved there, the lieutenant governors, the attorney generals. There has to be, quite a payoff that's gone on here. Quite a
Well, part of the payoff, if you look at these court records, is this is a godsend for all the major law firms in the U.S. and around the world. I mean, the amount of bankruptcy work they're getting out of this, representing the companies and also individuals. I mean, this is their payoff. Is this bad news story is a huge profit center for them.
Well, there never was a Satoshi Nakamoto. It was Goldman Sachs and the British created CIA who controlled this dark ops project, just like when DARPA created the DARPANet, or the original intranet was made for weapons development between universities. And then they said, hey, this works so good. Let's do all of our illegal black market money, our pornography, and our criminal activities on the dark web. So the dark web was created before the internet was given to the rest of us by Sir Berners-Lee's, the fake guy who created the World Wide Web. And so what is it that is really going on here? This was a system, this is a dialectic process. So there's the thesis, and the thesis is, oh, there's a magic money that's invisible and it's all digital, and it's in these trees, that hash trees, that it's perfect, it's infallible, it's the most wonderful thing. You don't even have, you could have an implant in your wrist and that's all you have to have. You don't have to have money. Let's get rid of
blockchain. You mentioned blockchain.
Oh yes, it's all blockchain.
It's got blockchain.
It's all fake. And why? Because they were setting up that was the fairy tale, that was the thesis. The antithesis is FTX, and now I understand Genesis is bankrupt, and then it's not even Bitcoin. Bitcoin is crashing so bad that no one is even believing in the fairy tale anymore. But by the way, that was the intention. And so FTX is the same system used to create the savings and loan debacle that cost us $2.5 trillion, so that the Republicans, particularly John McCain and the Keating Five, could run their Republican money laundering scam for their election money. And then later, Enron was the biggest supporter of Baby Bush. And Baby Bush never revealed who donated his money. And he donated, he spent more on that campaign, the first campaign, than anyone in history ever had. And it was all Enron fake money. And as Michael pointed out, the same old Rothschild agents, the Crown agents, these same old Babylonian cartel, banking cartel, are the people behind all of this. And they are the ones who select who's going to be put into office. And they are, in fact, then Crown agents after that. Now, the money that's going to Zelensky, hello, $27 billion already went from the IMF to them, and they never paid back a penny. And now we've given over $100 billion to them, and the Democrats just can't stop giving. But it's not just the Democrats. Remember, on the Burisma Oil Committee was not only Hunter Biden, but also John Kerry's stepson, and Cofer Black, who is Mitt Romney's right-hand man. So we have the corruption in Ukraine is so fantastic that the FTX running money through there is going to do nothing more than what happened with Enron or the Keating Five or the savings and loan scandal. As a matter of fact, the same lawyer, John J. the third, has been given control to hide the names of everyone that the FTX laundered money went to. This is standard operating procedure, and it used to just be the Chamber of Commerce, and then it branched out to PACs and then super PACs, and now you have corporations, or you have George Soros, who gives $100 million himself to the Democrats, but it's all stolen money. He paid no taxes on it.
The guy representing FTX was the CEO of Enron.
Kevin Lay?
No, Enron.
Oh, the CEO?
He was the CEO. I forget the guy's name. You just mentioned him.
Yeah. John J. the third is now going to cover up the FTX.
Right.
And the beauty of it is, you always know this, and we've told everybody this was going to happen. We predicted that it was a fraud. So you have the thesis, the fairy tale. You have the nightmare FTX. No one wants to mention the $100 billion that have been lost in the cryptocurrency exchanges. And no one can mention how much else was lost because people couldn't work the system because their wallets, or they lost the thing. I mean, you know how much money is lost in Bitcoin value that supposedly Satoshi Nakamoto has never cashed in? I mean, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in terms of trying to create the British one world currency. And by the way, it's happening because all federal agencies must be prepared, I think within the next month, to give their proposal on how to transfer their agency over to central bank cryptocurrency, digital currency. Now, let's remember, these are central banks. Those aren't ours. They belong to the U.S. Federal Reserve. These are foreign banksters. So if we go to this, and we won't because human nature won't allow it to happen, but if we go for the synthesis between the thesis, the fairy tale of Bitcoin, and the antithesis, the evil of FTX, then we go to the synthesis of supposedly a U.S. Treasury-driven currency. No, it's not. It is a central bank digital currency. And we have sold out then to foreign banksters because the United States Federal Reserve is owned by the same Babylonian cartel banking families that have created a corporate lineage that just doesn't seem to be stopped. And it's through intermarrying, it's through hiding behind the all kinds of organizations that protect the slander of a race that they try to say that they're part of, when I make a huge distinction between a Hebrew, especially an Ethiopian or a Samaritan Hebrew, and an Ashkenazi Hebrew. Okay? Because basically the Ashkenazi, none of them are purebred Hebrew. So there really is no such thing as what they call them. And what are they protecting? They're protecting what Micah's just pointed out. The cuneiform tablets would have proven that the same old bankster tricks are being used today as used 4,000 years ago. They can't have that come to light.
Well said, well said. And, it's, as we see it, the power consolidation just, opening up, so intensely now. And, at the G20, we had Christine Lagarde, saying exactly what you said. Like, we need the CBDCs, we need those because otherwise we're losing control. We're losing leverage. We need our leverage, is what you said. And just, coming out in the open saying, central banks have to control it all moving forward as this massive Ponzi scheme fiat currency crash is upon us, engineered in order to bring this about, of course, and this dependency and this, and, the destruction of Western civilization through all the criminal behavior of shutting down the energy, shutting down the supply chain, shutting down everything in order to control us even further. And it's a satanic plan. We all know it's a satanic plan. We know the people involved in this are the same people doing the human trafficking, the same people trafficking. We just found out that they stopped what was about to, when they're getting rid of Title 42, where they were going to give everyone humanitarian parole of all of the migrants in Mexico just waiting to pour over once Title 42 goes away in like 4 weeks now. And that human trafficking all planned. These people are the traffickers. Their whole wealth is just built on slavery, human trafficking, child trafficking, horrible, abuse, horrible, total desecration of human life in every way possible, in every kind of immorality. And so I wanted to wrap it up here. We're at almost 55 minutes. And if you all, maybe each of you would want to give a sort of comment on what I just said here and the spiritual level here that we're dealing with, because, for me as a Christian, my pastor says, it's our job to rush the gates of hell. We're not supposed to sit here and just hope we survive, and the spiritual warfare has been going on so long with this usury system as the weapon and the control mechanism, the slavery system, the prison planet. So I was wondering if each of you wanted to give a few words on that topic.
Well, one of the things, as you were talking about slavery, just look at Lord Mark Malloch Brown's background. He was emphasizing in his background his UN refugee business. And I forget the name of the company that he started with Soros. But the issue of refugees, they all care about the refugees. And what we can now see is the refugees are good for business. And as you mentioned, even the Vatican has its oar in that water as well. And your comment earlier about the hijacking of Christianity probably is a little bit more nuanced than that, in that the Christian church really had a major divide between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. And the Eastern Orthodox Church never accepted the primacy of the Pope. To this day, has never done that. And as a result, there is much more equanimity and conciliarity of that church that you don't see in the West. And I understand what you're saying about the Jesuits, but I would say Douglas will probably agree that the Jesuits didn't have total control of even Rome. There were a lot of other orders, and I have actually personally known many very holy people, very spiritual people in various orders of the Roman Catholic Church. We worked with a lot of Catholics in Europe and in Poland especially. We probably sang, when I was in a gospel music group, probably to over 3 million Poles. And it's a largely Roman Catholic area. We were invited there by then Cardinal Karol Wojtyła, who later became Pope. And so my experience is such that I've been able to, in my lifetime, turn over most of the stones in Christendom. And I would say that every church deals with the sin of humanity in their activities, and they've got their scoundrels. But I would say, in general, what we see now going on in the Ukraine is an interesting parallel with everything we're finding about the Babylonians right now, and the Babylonian Rodanites, and the way they moved westward. And you can change the name to Ashkenazi Jews, but what we see now is that the Ukraine, the Crimea, the former territory of the Khazars, these supposed Jewish converts, brings into play a number of different spiritual questions about the role of the demon of Mammon in the affairs of man, and how he is a powerful entity that can truly lead people astray and lead countries astray and lead companies astray. And I think that from a standpoint of spiritual warfare, that's what we're looking at when we look at the Babylonian Rodanites. We're looking at a demon that has been around for 4,000 years and knows what he's doing, and that what we have to use is faith and the salvation that Christ brought to this earth as the counterpoint and the ultimate victory over him.
Awesome. Well said. Really appreciate that. And Douglas, how about you?
Michael and I have been talking about the last week that Christ's first deed in the Holy Week was to go in and to take his cord, his belt, turn it into a whip, turn over the money changers' tables, and basically chase out the Babylonian Rodanites from the temple, and basically making sure that people understood what he said later: give unto Caesar what is Caesar's and give unto God what is God. Well, when God gets connected to Mammon, the worship of money, well, this is what the Hebrews did again and again. And Moses had to make them take their golden calf and powderize it, put it in their water and drink it. because the golden calf needed to be ended. It needed to, if you worship gold, and in these cases we're worshiping gold and silver and coinage, then it takes away from you worshiping God. You can only have one master. And what we're saying here is that the corporate lineages of bankster families that still control the world and have for 4,000 years are basically ignoring God and going towards mammon. So the answer, the solution, is simply to be aware of the evil and attempt to keep it out of your own life and go to God. Don't go to mammon.
Amen.
Awesome. It's been a wonderful interview. So much great information, and we're going to continue on in this series and just keep hearing all the revelations that you all have been finding out in your incredible research. And so just so everybody knows, you can go and find Michael's work on americanspiritinnovation.blogspot.com. And then we have Douglas's gab.com/Gabriels_horn. And again, it's there below in the banner. So, and aimfortruth.org. Of course, where so much information is constantly being put up. So get in there and dig into this information so we can broaden the conversation across the social media platforms and trying to move forward into this really dark time, but also really incredible time as people are awakening so enormously everywhere. That's why we're able to have these conversations and able to take on this giant monster, this satanic monster, and understand that it's people of everywhere, all around the world, are good people, good people of all faiths and traditions. And we want to join together and defeat the satanic parts of these, of how deception and really theft, deception, and manipulation is that hand of Satan that has led to this consolidation of power. But as we're aware, they can't deceive us as easily anymore, and it's getting harder and harder for them. So we're winning, and it's good news. And so that's where we'll leave it now. I want to say happy Thanksgiving to everyone. Happy Thanksgiving to you too.
Thank you.
We'll see you all next time, and you are free. Stay free.
Thank you.
Hi, freedom lovers. I hope you really enjoyed today's video. I certainly enjoyed making it for you and want to continue to do this work all the time on You Are Free TV. And so if you want to help support the channel, there are the links below the description in the video. And there's also, of course, a sponsor that I now have, which is C60 Evo. And C60 Evo is the ESS60 incredible miracle molecule that really helps to give you vitality. It cleans out your mitochondria. It gives you enormous brain activation, as well as help to protect from radiation such as 5G and the 6G systems, as well as protecting your cells from the invaders coming down, raining down from the sky with geoengineering, etc. And c60evo.com/YAFTV will give you the code of YAFTV that you put in there. You get 10% off from c60evo.com. So I hope that you will consider that another way to support the channel. And also, folks who are monthly supporters of You Are Free TV can also get 15% off when you make donations to the links below. And so I so appreciate you make this channel happen. And so I'm also really thankful to C60 Evo for being able to now support the channel as well. And through your support, we'll keep this going. So you are free, and I will see you next time.